Early American history loves the myth of the solitary genius, the isolated intellectual sitting alone in a dimly lit study, forging the ideas of a new nation through sheer, independent willpower. Yet, the extraordinary career of Timothy Dwight, the legendary president of Yale College and grandson of Jonathan Edwards, completely shatters this individualistic narrative. Prevented by excruciating neurological pain from reading or writing text for more than a few minutes at a time, Dwight's massive contributions to American Protestantism were forged not in isolation, but within a radical, highly systemic network of collaborative human labor. Standard historical accounts consistently position Dwight as an architect of American higher education and a towering presence in the early republic's theological landscape. Yet these traditional narratives often succumb to a profound paradox. They celebrate his vast administrative, literary, and theological milestones while treating his severe physical limitations as a mere biographical footnote, a tragic obstacle overcome by individual grit. By pushing past this romanticized trope, a more nuanced reality emerges regarding Dwight's tenure at Yale and his orchestrating role in the Second Great Awakening. His extraordinary achievements did not occur despite his near-total blindness. Rather, they materialized by virtue of a structural reconfiguration of academic labor. Facing strict medical prohibitions that barred him from standard textual engagement, Dwight could not participate in the isolated habits of the Enlightenment scholar. Instead, he pioneered an intellectual infrastructure rooted in collaborative scholarship, auditory technology, and advanced mnemonic cultivation. This strategic shift from visual literacy to a shared acoustic ecosystem challenges long-held assumptions concerning early American intellectual production, offering instead a compelling historical model of academic interdependence. To appreciate the scale of Dwight's later adaptation, one must first look at the punishing physical environment that precipitated his condition. The academic culture of 18th century Yale was deeply intertwined with a rigorous Puritan work ethic that equated relentless, self-denying labor with spiritual devotion. Intellectual pursuit was not viewed as a comfortable pastime, but rather as an arduous calling demanding the total subjugation of the body. Scholars routinely forced themselves into grueling routines, which included initiating intense textual study by substandard, flickering candlelight as early as 4:30 a.m., following a brutal encounter with smallpox, a disease that frequently left survivors with systemic weaknesses, and a period marked by near-starvation dieting. His physical constitution was severely compromised. The unrelenting ocular strain of deciphering dense texts in near darkness, imposed upon an already weakened system, triggered a chronic, debilitating ophthalmic disease. This rapid, painful deterioration culminated in a state of near-total blindness, forever altering the trajectory of his career. The onset of this visual impairment triggered an immediate existential and vocational crisis, given the rigid social constructs of the 18th century. In early America, blindness was widely perceived not merely as a physical inconvenience, but as an absolute functional disqualifier from public leadership, academic instruction, and pastoral service. The entire machinery of the ministry and higher education presupposed a visually literate leader who could pore over scripture, analyze classical texts, and draft written discourses in solitude. To lose one's sight was, in the eyes of contemporary society, to lose the very capacity to fulfill an intellectual or spiritual calling. Beyond these external social barriers, the internal subjective experience of the impairment imposed an agonizing burden. Dwight had to navigate excruciating, near-permanent headaches that accompanied his ophthalmic decline, a physical torment that threatened to derail his mental focus entirely. He was forced to confront the terrifying prospect of professional extinction while striving to preserve his identity as a scholar pastor. The absolute boundary of his disability was dictated by an unyielding medical prohibition. Reading or writing text for more than a few consecutive minutes was strictly forbidden, as it risked exacerbating his neurological agony. Cut off from the foundational tools of his trade, Dwight stood at a critical crossroads, facing a choice between permanent retirement or inventing a completely unprecedented method of scholarly creation. The onset of near-total blindness did not simply present a medical challenge. It threatened Dwight with total social and professional erasure within the rigid hierarchy of early America. 18th century society viewed profound physical limitations through a highly exclusionary lens, routinely equating a loss of sight with a permanent loss of social utility and leadership capacity. The entire infrastructure of the Christian ministry and higher education was built upon the absolute assumption of visual literacy. A leader was expected to independently read original Greek and Hebrew manuscripts, manually draft extensive weekly discourses, and visually monitor the conduct of a congregation or student body. Consequently, contemporary observers widely assumed that Dwight's career was effectively finished. To be an intellectual who could no longer engage with a printed page meant confronting an absolute barrier to employment and public influence. This functional disqualifier put him at risk of being cast out of the very institutions he had spent his youth preparing to lead, forcing him to face a culture that saw his disability as an insurmountable deficit rather than a condition requiring structural accommodation. Beyond the external threat of social marginalization, Dwight had to navigate a profound internal crisis marked by constant physical torment and existential uncertainty. The decay of his vision was accompanied by a severe, chronic neurological consequence, agonizing, near-permanent headaches that flared up at the slightest attempt to focus his eyes. This persistent pain served as an unyielding physical boundary, threatening to shatter his mental focus and exhaust his cognitive capacity. His situation was further complicated by an absolute non-negotiable medical prohibition. Physicians explicitly warned him that attempting to read or write text for more than a few consecutive minutes would cause a total neurological collapse and accelerate his physical decline. This restriction severed his access to the traditional, isolated tools of scholarship. Left in a silent study filled with books he could no longer read and blank paper he could no longer fill, Dwight faced an agonizing psychological crucible. He had to choose between accepting permanent professional obscurity or completely reconstructing the mechanics of intellectual production from the ground up. The traditional paradigm of the early American intellectual heavily prized the motif of the solitary genius, working deep into the night in an isolated study. For Dwight, remaining within this individualistic model meant intellectual extinction. Consequently, survival required a complete systemic overhaul of his physical and academic workspace. He accomplished this by engineering a highly organized infrastructure centered on a daily, rigorous rotation of Yale students who acted as his personal readers and scribes, historically termed amanuenses. Rather than viewing this arrangement as an unfortunate crutch or a temporary fix, Dwight structured this collective labor into a highly reliable, recurring administrative apparatus. This structural shift transformed the very nature of learning and mentorship at the college. By embedding this accommodation into the core of his daily routine, Dwight turned a personal necessity into a highly innovative pedagogical mechanism. The elite students chosen for this rotation were not executing mindless clerical labor. Instead, they received an intimate, immersive education as they read massive volumes of history, philosophy, and classical theology aloud to their president. As they captured his spoken thoughts on paper, these students witnessed the immediate, real-time synthesis of complex ideas. This arrangement effectively decentralized the act of scholarship, converting the president's private office into an active, shared laboratory of collaborative pedagogy. Transitioning away from a text-based, visually driven method of research demanded a profound cognitive restructuring, forcing Dwight to swap standard visual literacy for an incredibly advanced form of auditory literacy. In a culture where authority was anchored to written, text-based validation, Dwight had to develop a way to process, retain, and analyze vast amounts of data strictly through sound. His mind became a dynamic acoustic archive. He listened to texts being read, mapped their internal logic by ear, and filed away entire arguments in his memory to be retrieved during later dictation sessions. The mechanics of composing long-form literature entirely through the spoken word required immense mental discipline and precise structural planning. Without the capability to glance back at a previous paragraph or flip through a rough draft to check his progress, Dwight had to hold the overarching architecture of his compositions entirely in his head. Through this auditory technique, he dictated expansive epic poems like Greenfield Hill and successfully constructed his monumental multi-volume systematic theology, Theology Explained and Defended. He would speak intricate paragraph-length sentences aloud to his student scribes, perfectly maintaining stylistic flow and structural integrity without ever setting eye to paper. This approach proved that complex intellectual production could be effectively driven by acoustic design rather than physical sight. The challenge of the 18th century pulpit. The expectations surrounding New England Congregationalism in the late 18th and early 19th centuries presented a severe challenge to a minister with profound visual loss. The regional religious culture expected sermons to be intellectually rigorous, tightly organized, and heavily reliant on dense scriptural cross-references and complex doctrines. To deliver such exhaustive discourses, ministers traditionally leaned on extensive, meticulously drafted sermon notes, frequently reading directly from their manuscripts to ensure absolute theological precision. Heavy reliance on written manuscripts and notes, reading directly to congregation under dim lighting. But Dwight's had adaptive pulpit paradigm, complete reliance on internal mnemonic architecture, dynamic, unscripted, direct oratorical delivery. For Dwight, matching this expected rigor through traditional means was physically impossible. The dim, flickering candlelight of an early American meeting house made reading fine manuscript notes an agonizing, counterproductive task. Because he was medically barred from looking at text, he could not use the standard visual guides that his peers relied on to keep their place and maintain structural order. Had he chosen to adapt by offering simplistic, improvised exhortations, he risked losing his intellectual authority and alienating a highly demanding congregation that expected deep, systematic theology. To overcome these rigid cultural boundaries, Dwight cultivated an extraordinary, near-photographic auditory memory as an intentional cognitive strategy. Rather than viewing memory as a simple tool for rote recitation, he developed it into an expansive internal canvas. Through his work with student readers, he could systematically review, edit, and organize long, complex rhetorical outlines entirely within his mind before ever stepping up to the pulpit. When preaching, Dwight would present highly sophisticated, structurally flawless arguments completely from memory, operating entirely without the aid of written notes. This absolute command over his material had a powerful effect on his audience. While his contemporaries often remained anchored to their written pages, Dwight's unscripted, direct gaze created an intense, immediate connection with the congregation. The absence of physical notes combined with his focused, sightless delivery gave his preaching an undeniable sense of prophetic authority, charisma, and spiritual gravity. This distinctive oratorical style became a key factor in commanding attention and stirring deep religious conviction during the early waves of the Second Great Awakening. When Timothy Dwight assumed the presidency of Yale College in 1795, he confronted an institutional ecosystem steeped in spiritual turmoil and intellectual defiance. The campus reflected a broader transatlantic shift, heavily influenced by French skepticism and revolutionary anti-clericalism. Students openly embraced secularism, went so far as to adopt the monikers of prominent European infidels, and frequently engaged in mock parodies of traditional Christian ministers. For an Orthodox theologian, This environment represented a severe crisis of authority that threatened to turn the college into a breeding ground for radical deism. To reestablish order, Dwight abandoned the standard administrative playbook of administrative censorship, opting instead for direct, unyielding intellectual combat. He initiated open debate forums where students were invited to present their strongest arguments against Orthodox Christianity. Operating without the capacity to reference live texts or scan written notes during these heated confrontations, Dwight relied entirely on his deeply cultivated internal library. He listened intently to student arguments, categorized their foundational premises by ear, and systematically dismantled complex Enlightenment deism solely from memory. By meeting the student body on the open field of rational debate and utilizing his finely honed oratorical skills, he proved that his orthodoxy was intellectually superior to contemporary skepticism. This approach completely altered the cultural trajectory of the college without ever requiring him to look at a single page. The long-term fruit of this dialectical strategy manifested in the celebrated Yale revivals, which fundamentally altered the spiritual landscape of the student body. Dwight's adaptation of his physical limitations directly fueled these spiritual awakenings. Because his sermons were delivered with mathematical precision and structural clarity, born of his rigorous mental outlining process, they appealed directly to the intellect of a skeptical student audience. The resulting revivals were not characterized by chaotic emotional outbursts, but by an orderly, rational alignment with Christian doctrine, which swept through the classes and produced a new generation of educated leaders. Through these campus awakenings, Dwight successfully achieved a major democratization of new divinity theology. He stripped the traditional high Calvinist doctrines of his grandfather, Jonathan Edwards, of their overly abstract scholasticism, presenting instead a highly rational, accessible, and practical orthodoxy. This reimagined theological framework provided the core energy for the emerging American missionary movement and the vast network of voluntary benevolent societies that defined the 19th century. By demonstrating that an orthodox worldview could be actively engaged in solving contemporary societal problems, Dwight's acoustic scholarship left an indelible mark on the global spread of American Protestantism. Placing Timothy Dwight within the expanding framework of modern disability history uncovers a profound historiographical shift. For generations, standard biographies treated his physical impairment through a classic tragedy and triumph lens, depicting his blindness as a personal misfortune that he overcame through sheer willpower. This individualistic narrative isolates the scholar, celebrating an idealized form of rugged independence while ignoring the actual mechanisms that make achievement possible. When evaluated through a socio-cultural lens, Dwight's tenure at Yale serves as an early American exemplar of radical academic interdependence. His survival as a leading intellectual was made possible by constructing a shared, community-supported ecosystem of labor. This arrangement reframes our understanding of intellectual agency. It shows that his work was not produced despite his limitation, but was actively shaped by the collective structures he designed to accommodate it. Dwight's office challenges the deeply rooted Enlightenment myth of the solitary thinker, proving that some of the early republic's most influential ideas came from a highly collaborative network. Ultimately, Timothy Dwight's historic legacy stands as a striking testament to systemic adaptation at the highest levels of institutional leadership. Forced by physical necessity to abandon traditional visual literacy, he turned his domestic and academic spaces into an innovative center for auditory scholarship. By organizing the student amanuensis rotation, maximizing his incredible photographic auditory memory, and refining a commanding pulpit style independent of written notes, he maintained a position at the absolute vanguard of American religion and higher education. The theological constructs and institutional achievements of the Second Great Awakening cannot be isolated from the acoustic environment in which they were conceived. The rational, structured sermons that transformed Yale and revitalized American Calvinism were forged entirely within the resilient architecture of a blind scholar's memory. By honoring the collaborative structures that supported his life's work, history reveals a far richer picture of the early republic, one where profound physical vulnerability gave rise to an innovative, enduring model of intellectual community. The journey of Timothy Dwight challenges us to look past the modern myth of the solitary thinker and consider how our greatest vulnerabilities can give rise to our most enduring innovations. True intellectual and spiritual legacy is rarely forged in absolute isolation. Instead, it is sustained by the communities and systems we build to support one another. As we look back at the resilient acoustic architecture of Dwight's mind, we are forced to re-examine what it truly means to build a collaborative intellectual community. How can we shift our own focus away from the exhausting pursuit of rugged independence and toward a healthier model of shared, interdependent labor? In what ways do our current environments overlook the hidden potential of those navigating profound physical or systemic limitations? Join us next week as we journey across the Atlantic to explore the fragile mind and profound theology of William Cowper, the melancholic hymn writer. We will unpack the deeply moving historical narrative of a brilliant literary figure who battled severe, lifelong mental anguish, yet managed to pen some of the most enduring and comforting hymns in the English language. If you want to continue uncovering the hidden stories, institutional histories, and profound figures that shaped our spiritual and cultural landscape, make sure to subscribe to Theology today. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode as we continue to analyze history through a deeper, more analytical lens.